Let me just focus on some of the points that might ignite and streamline the discussion going forward. And I might use, should I use a presentation that I have, which will highlight it? Yeah, so I'll just use a small
Sure.
slideshow. This basically is a part of a info deck which we have prepared, which is titled Tales of Transition. This is the second in series. We have earlier published one on electric mobility and its just transition. This info deck, as you can see, is basically talking about um, some of the global developments, then funneling it down to national and then state specific developments. We'll be making it public soon after this event. And for the sake of this discussion, I'll just focus on the Rajasthan specific part of it. And before beginning, let me just put it out there that I read this interesting interview on CNBC of Mr. Francesco Stares. He is the CEO of Enel, which is an Italian energy company. And he highlighted a statement which, in a way, sums up my presentation and submission also. He said that the risk of energy transition is that it will only benefit a few going forward. And the underlying notion was that if we consider it as a transition from point A to point B, then we are looking at it in a linear way. But a transition, in order to yield results, will also have to take into account an externalities, and it will be not merely a transition, but a transformation in the way in which we are seeing things. So now jumping right at the Rajasthan specific picture, quickly some stats. We have almost 26 gigawatts of installed capacity. Most of it comes from coal, lignite, and gas, while a sizable share is from renewables as well. And this also stems from the fact that we have good natural advantages, high insulation potential, high wind potential, etc. And it is slightly better than the national picture as well. And when it comes to the generation mix, the thermal still dominates the scenario. But the key point to take away from here is that the thermal is stemming from some inefficiencies which are evident at a national as well as state specific scale, with plant load factors falling to almost 54%. Now, going forward, what are some of the drivers and some of the developments that have happened? I already talked about the natural advantages that are there. There are concerted push from the state level policies and targets, 30 gigawatt of solar, 4 gigawatt of wind, and also hybrid wind, solar, wind, thermal, and solar thermal powers. And the policy instruments which are used for this promotion are basically the same old incentives, subsidies, some exemptions, or any other convergence with any investment or industrial policies. The other drivers are the extremely competitive price discoveries that we are seeing in RE projects. Aarti, you mentioned it in the beginning that some of the lowest tariffs have been discovered here, and a welcome development is NTPC venturing out into the solar game. Um, Other drivers could be the inefficiencies which are in the thermal power in the state at almost rupees 4.2, 4.3 generation cost. The thermal power is on a costlier side. And there are low cost alternatives available for the low hanging consumers, which can be the CNI consumers, which are currently opting for captive or open access. And this could, in a way, also affect the transition and the status quoist regime in the power sector value chain. There are also some very insightful and engaging developments happening for strengthening the solar agricultural linkages. The country's first solar plant under Kusum scheme was launched in Rajasthan in Kotputli, which is a few kilometers from Jaipur only, very recently. And in the recent budget, the Chief Minister of Rajasthan also announced a separate DISCOM for agriculture feeders. So that is also a welcome development, which is strengthening this linkage. Now, if we see this transition from a power sector and a statistical perspective, there's this study done by IFA, led by my friend Kashish, where he tried to project a model in which for all the incremental demand that is to come in the state of Rajasthan, what if it is completely met by RE? And he tried to incorporate the sound principles of cost economics into it. And according to that projection, keeping in mind the impact of pandemic and everything, the projection said that we need 34 terawatt hours of new incremental power generation, and that would imply solar taking up most of the charge, but also some backing down of thermal close to 15 terawatt hours. So the existing capacities of thermal, which stands almost as at around 9.8 gigawatt, with another 1.9 gigawatt in the pipeline at pre-permit operations and construction stages, they would need to come down to around 9 gigawatt, which implies a sizable chunk of close to 1 gigawatt would need to back out or decommission. And then there comes the implication of this backing out on other coal economies and other conventional economies and stakeholders which are dependent on their lives and livelihoods and incomes on these sectors. But the thing that we are also adopting in the project that Amol talked about in the beginning, which is on just transition, is that we are trying to move beyond numbers. And when I say that, I mean that we are looking at what these numbers entail for the people, planet, and the profits and the economies and the environment, etc. So from quantitative to qualitative shift is something which is underpinning this. And basically, I've tried to use a systems thinking approach to inform what are these complex linkages and different stakeholders which are involved in this. So at the basis of it is that we generate power, we generate it to different sources. They can be coal, renewable, or other sources. The revenues of this power generation through discoms essentially come from the consumer's pocket. Therefore, power consumption is the sole source of revenue for the entire power value chain, and therefore risk rewards are dependent and spreaded in that manner. And if we consider two measures of this power consumption, one could be per capita consumption, or one could be the purchasing power or willingness of consumers. Both these metrics, when looked at from the objectives of socioeconomic development, they demand that these things go up. Socioeconomic welfare goes up, consumers have more to spend, consumers consume more per capita so that the developmental goals can become a reality. Whereas from all these three sources of generation, there are life cycle emissions associated with it, which trigger climate change. And climate change then also has their own feedback into this socioeconomic welfare. So it's all about balancing the developmental paradigms with the environmental paradigms, but not necessarily seeing them as oxymorons, something that can't coexist together. And while transitioning, the important point that I made in the opening quote that I used was also about inclusivity, which stems from the fact that the predominantly coal-based economy, which gives livelihoods to estimated around 1.2 million people in India, which drives local economy, and that coal economy itself gives a lot of revenues to the government in the form of loyalties and other tax payments, which again feed back into the developmental paradigm of socioeconomic welfare, which can be beneficial for the consumer. So a transition to RE, it does not necessarily have to complete this circuit if coal goes away and renewable comes in, but is also have to make corrections in the way the entire system is placed. We are not saying that the livelihoods in the coal currently are everything is all well and good there. So there are things, there are externalities even beyond the representation which is in this system, and therefore inclusivity in its entirety should be the mantra going forward. And just transition and systems thinking can just be good enablers which can propel this. So I'll leave all of you with some questions or some thoughts that you might want to express your views upon, which entail with a balancing of the interest of these different stakeholders, and not balancing it in a way so that it is essentially an art of wise compromise, but it becomes a convergence of ideas and leading to some achievement of a shared vision. The next is financing the transition. A lot of development is happening on that front, but how can we infuse in more transparency and outcome orientation in those financing mechanisms? how can we strengthen the existing transmission and distribution infrastructure and infuse efficiency into the system? What could be the way forward for going about decommissioning? And how can we finally make it more innovative, people centric, and demand driven so that not only there's a push factor, but also there's a pull factor to it. Since I started off with a quote, let me end with a quote as well. Maybe this can give that ideological backing to the discussion, and I'd rather not read it, so it's out there. Aarti, I'm done. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarthak, and you and Rohit ji and Mr. Kulkarni. I mean, each one of you have stressed on some of the same aspects of how the transition will not be easy, but the fact that it has to be done. You also alluded to NTPC going 60 gigawatts, and just yesterday was this enormous news of also Reliance making a big investment of about 75,000 crores or roughly $10 billion to set up its green business. And all these are clearly writings on the wall, and they're not happening without a lot of other factors also playing underground. What we are seeing is indeed just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how big giants like Reliance, like NTPC are shifting away. But really the questions do come back, especially in a seminar like this, where you're talking about what the future for the state will be. There are a lot more questions to answer than just the big ticket items which appeal to big corporations, big countries, and big agenda. There is the issue of discom woes, how discoms are bleeding, how it is still tough for them to respect the legacy PPAs, how to procure power from solar and wind. The question of what's the cost and benefit, and just really how the backing down from coal thermal power plants will actually take place. I don't have answers for this, but at least for the next 1 hour, we have 4 experts who have taken out time to join us today. And I would like to welcome each one of them as we start a discussion for the next 30 to 40 minutes. And then we will open the floor and would like to take some of the comments and insights and questions from the participants and try to round up our discussion. But today, I'd like to welcome Mr. Amit Kumar. He's the Senior Director for the work on social transformation at TERI, and some of us who have done the rite of passage through TERI have known Mr. Kumar for very many years. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us, and look forward to hearing from you in a short while. We also have Kartikeya Singh. Kartikeya is the Director of Programs at the SED Fund, has been a close partner with some of us in our work, and fully invested in all aspects of energy transition and especially financing. Thanks, Kartikeya, for joining us. We have Swati D'Souza. Swati is the research lead at the National Foundation of India, follows the debate very closely, and has various good insights to share. In my little knowledge of having interacted with you, Swati, on Twitter, at least I've found all your commentary over there, hitting the nail on the head. So looking forward to interacting with you and hearing more from you. And last but not the least, we have Simran. Simran Grover heads the Past Research Foundation, have done a lot of work in the state, and will be able to just share perspectives from the ground. Our intention is that with all 4 panelists, each one of them quite distinguishable and distinct in their areas of expertise, we do want to bring the story together, not just for Rajasthan, but also just an example of how a state which actually started renewables when the current hype was not there, back in the late 90s, how the conversation has grown. And today, when there is so much interest and excitement about renewable technology, what does it mean for a state like Rajasthan? So, maybe Kartikeya, because there has been such a wide and immediate interest in what NTPC is doing. Yesterday's Reliance story has made a lot of people keenly watch what the space is about. So clearly Reliance and NTPC are not doing this because this is a good moral argument, and that's the way it should be done. And they must have been looking for incentives for far too long. And now it just seems that with the way the global capital has also been shifting away from fossil fuels, there is a certain ambition, which all the corporations are seeing and the states are seeing as well. Rajasthan, like Rohitji also said, and some of the other speakers, it has very ambitious targets for wind and solar. How does all this shake up for you in terms of what do you think are the opportunities for the state to bring winds of change, so to speak, but which also balance the interest of the government, the distribution company, as well as the consumers? So I'm really trying to ask you a question which addresses the financial imperatives, but also make sure that the state is able to balance the interests of consumers, Discom, and other key parties involved in the transition.
Sure, Aarti. No small task to try and summarize all that, and I would hope that there is a desire on the moral imperative front from NTPC and Reliance, but I think it is an accurate reflection, and I will have to say I don't know if it was well timed. It must have certainly been in the works, but it is coming on the heels of such seismic shift in how investors and asset managers are doing the job of government, in the sense of they're putting tremendous pressure to shift the capital from where it has been and force some of these corporations to be more proactive in making the transition. And I mean, I think the example globally that has come out was the sort of day of reckoning for oil and gas companies that passed a month ago or so, where Shell was forced to by a court here in The Hague, where I'm based, to deepen its cuts and its targets for emissions reductions from up and down the value chain of the products it develops and distributes. Not just the one scope of the emissions, and the other piece is the investors and shareholders of Exxon really changing this behemoth of a company to be more progressive. And so it's clear that for the privately held companies, which are responsible to shareholders, and shareholders are going to become more activist on this topic, they're going to need to respond. And I think that's what we're starting to see from maybe some of the private companies in India. And I think it's important. I'm pleased about the announcement from Reliance. I mean, ultimately, Reliance too is a large employer, has a major impact on India's economy, and it needs to be a part of the transition. And I think there's major value add to Indian oil and gas firms and the industry, the petrochemical industry in India, which is such a sizable part of the economy, to start making that transition. Imagine a world where their business verticals are more inclusive of forward-looking technologies and sectors. And timed with that is the redefinition of mineral oils by the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas to be more inclusive of cleaner energy sources like hydrogen. So there's the private sector that is, I think, going to start to make those moves. We have large state-owned enterprises, which their shareholders are the government, and it becomes difficult when the government is also dependent on a fossil value chain and tax revenues and jobs that are created from that. So again, the announcement from NTPC is significant that they were quick to move. What we're hearing from Coal India on diversifying their value chain is also reading, the writing on the wall. And these are centrally controlled entities, and so that's all well and good. But I think it becomes trickier when you get to the state level, and this is where the state governments need to think about how they can successfully navigate this transition. And when we talk about having we're lucky that we're talking about Rajasthan in this case, and not a Bengal or a Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh that are so wedded to the coal value chain. I mean, I know that the transition as it rolls out in Rajasthan won't be apples to apples. Some people will lose their jobs, but at least it's a state that on net has the resources, the fundamental energy source to feed the feedstock, if you will, for the future energy sources or the energy sources that are growing. It's a matter of thinking about where to trim the fat and the budgets to make sure that there is a suitable, there's a balanced and stable pathway to getting there that protects the consumers, you're right, because ultimately ratepayers are going to be on the hook for some of this infrastructure development. But then there's a real need to look at where switch and swaps can be made and where the enabling environment for the business for Rajasthan to get the financing it needs for this transition to happen. And so I know that we asked this question of the MD of sort of phasing down of thermal. I think back in 2017, the Chhabra thermal power plant was loss-making and the government was trying to shed that asset. And then with the coming of the new government, they decided not to. I think they managed to change the finances of that power plant. I'm not sure, what the state of play is now. I know they've commissioned 2 more units there. But as it comes time for old amortized units to be phased down, I think there's going to be a real need to evaluate the value of the land that those plants sit on and how they might be turned around to instead, maybe through bulk procurement and new kinds of tendering to do battery energy storage systems plus the large renewables capacity that the state has to install. Plus, they're looking at pumped storage to deal with some of these seasonal variability issues. So I think showing to the investor community that Rajasthan is actively tackling the issues of circular debt and discom, fiscal challenges that they continue to face is going to be one way to ensure that the state is able to procure funds, because they're blessed with solar and wind. And that's going to require making some really hard decisions about letting go of certain assets and monetizing them in new ways. And I think there's a lot to be said about the justness of it all, and maybe we'll come to it. But I just want to add that, one of the things in Sarthak's presentation was the coal versus lignite consumption in the plant, right? Rajasthan it has lignite mines. And so there is a question of transition for the mining community there. But if the majority of the coal is coming from out of state, as every state thinks, and this is my experience of engaging with Indian states, is every state wants to be power surplus and energy secure, which is a problem because we're trying to integrate the national market and have more purchases be through the power exchange and feel some security in being able to do that. And that will take some socialization, but Rajasthan won't have to contend with the sort of coal mines that are feeding a large portion of their power plants, which are feeding the economies of eastern and central states. So the question is, how much does Rajasthan want to think about its impact on the just transition of the coal value chain in other states versus just protect the jobs and think of sort of its role in the transition? So with that, I will cede some ground for other comments.
Thanks very much, Karthik. I was actually moderating one panel yesterday, and this is quite unrelated, but one of the panelists from Oxfam made this very nice comment on Shell and Exxon and the big oil and gas companies, that this is no more about shareholder activism, it's also stakeholder activism. And I think it became quite clear, especially with these examples of companies on how they've been pushed for more climate action, that it's no more just shareholder, it's also many more stakeholders which are involved. I mean, you spoke a lot. I think there is lots in there to come back, but just coming back to the initial question, which we were also trying, at least I was hoping, Mr. Rohit Gupta would have answered in some detail, but just back to that question, but especially in this group who's also quite invested in the climate discussion, I think there are the broader climate goals on the one hand, and Simran, I'm looking at you to come in now, but also there is the whole social justice angle on the other hand. Basque Research Foundation, your values and your principles are quite a lot about doing people-centric work, looking at energy access, not just from the point of view of bringing down emissions, but also from the point of view of how it's bringing energy adequacy to the last mile. Now, between all of this, there is this basic question on how the energy transition goals stack up thermal power plants on the one hand and the need to procure increased RE on the other hand, and just in the short term. And you all will know better than me, but all these issues of legacy thermal power contracts and long-term power purchase agreements, which are inhibiting the discoms from purchasing renewables, even if it is cheaper. What's the situation analysis in Rajasthan? How is it looking? What are the actual mechanical, technical issues around this, apart from just the issues of broader climate goals or issues of transition? But really, when discoms are looking at, financial, like what's on the table for them in terms of cost savings, how is it that they should procure more renewables when they're still stuck with long-term PPAs, and what is happening in Rajasthan? Simran, do you want to check your audio? This is breaking out a lot. I think it's not your internet, but it's your microphone or the earphone. If it's a Bluetooth or a wireless, then I suggest please use old technology.
Is that better?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. Let me begin by saying that, I personally empathize with the discoms, especially in Rajasthan, right? They are, for me, like an underperforming child who is blamed for everything, right? Discoms carry the most risk of the sector, and they're blamed by everybody. They are the beating bag of by the people, the consumers, the politicians, of course, the private industry, and often media and agencies like ourselves, right? But let's look at the question that you raised. How do we look into the issue of the legacy contracts that we have, thermal contracts that we have? And I'll try to look at this through three lenses. From a lens of governance, from lens of operations of the grid, and third is the financial, right? So from a governance perspective, discoms have no decision-making power. In Rajasthan, at least, it's the RUVN, Rajasthan Utpadan Vikas Nigam, who is responsible and who holds the contracts for all the three discoms. And they are the ones who also contract new power. Right? There's a state energy committee who decides on the long-term planning. And strangely, in Rajasthan, we plan only for 5 years, and we have performed quite poorly in terms of in terms of accuracy of long-term planning of energy demands in Rajasthan, and also increasing so on the pattern of the demand. Right? That's one reason that we are seeing excess capacity, and the scenario is shared across many states in India, reflecting the poor capacity and regulatory transparency of these processes. Moving forward from an operational perspective, if we look at some of the data points in Rajasthan, we see that despite excess capacity, we are looking at on day-to-day basis, discoms are procuring from the markets, not just cheaper power, but also expensive power, right? Which is very strange news to us. Would be very strange news to many stakeholders. Secondly, they're also paying a significant amount under the deviation settlement mechanism, a burden which is eventually transferred to the consumers. Now, what does it tell us from an RE perspective? From my understanding, what it says is that our current distribution capacity of gridding RE integration is very poor. We don't even not only have the flexibility or resource flexibility to integrate renewable sources, but we are also not looking at low-hanging fruits of better forecasting, integrating incentives like time of the day power or similar other measures to improve demand flexibility, etc. Right? And thirdly, if we look at from a financial perspective, now this becomes more trickier. A recent Forum of Regulators study indicated that if must-run evacuation of RE was not there, and distribution companies were flexible in their procurement, they would have, in the selected they did a study about 9 to 10 states, the states would have saved around 12,000 to 14,000 crores in terms of procurement benefits. This is simply because still the marginal cost of thermal is still less than RE in most of the cases. Definitely, there are plants which will defy that, and they will mostly be rejected under the MOD merit order dispatch principle. But still, for many plants, the marginal cost is much lower. That being said, there is still an opportunity in dissolving these assets, but these powers again lie with the state government and the institutions like RUVN and RVUN, right? So distribution companies in the end have a very little role, very little capabilities to play in at least in the current governance structure, to play in the an active role in the energy transition of the state. And I'll just end with that.
Okay, so what you're saying is that it's not, as a layperson, one would understand that discoms are not encouraging renewables, but the troubles lie far deeper into how the whole system is set up. And as long as you can pay the fixed cost, it is still better off to be paying a lower variable cost for an existing thermal power plant than pay a slightly higher cost for new solar or new wind. But I think that opens a next can of worms then, that how long do you also keep paying the fixed costs, and how, maybe you wait 2-3 years or 5 years till the time those PPAs actually expire, and then it logically and naturally makes sense to do fresh ones with lesser cost overall. But, Kartikeya talked about the social aspects of the transition. You also mentioned about it. Swati, as somebody who has been interested in the whole concept of energy transition in India, I think enough has been said here about how the coal economy has been beneficial so far to the socio-economic landscape. It provides jobs. It has been king coal. It's no longer that. But as the shakeout is happening, there is going to be impact on more than what we see. What do you think, are the elements of how an energy transition should be funded in a way that it also keeps social and environmental welfare at its heart? And maybe if I can explain a little bit more, then it will be nice to hear from you, because, the phrase like just transition has become such a catchphrase, not just in India and across the world, that it's risky to overuse it and not deliver on the actual elements of it. So rather than getting into big words and big catchphrases, what are the few pertinent things just to keep in mind for a state like Rajasthan, that whatever it does in the right direction? I think regardless of everything, the state and all the other states will have to buy more solar and wind, will have to set up more of that. Coal will have to go away. So given all these inevitabilities, what are the few things to keep in mind just to make sure that the transition is just? And, we are 100 years away from justice in the world, clearly, but maybe one step at a time.
Thank you, Aarti. Thank you, Sarthak. Hello to all of my fellow panelists. It's been a very interesting discussion because Kartikeya spoke about how to finance some elements of this of the transition from a techno-economic angle, and Simran gave points on what are the challenges again on the techno-economic side. The common aspect over here is when we are looking at energy transition in India, so far we've been looking at financing the technical and the economic aspects when it comes to increasing, enhancing your grid capacity, upscaling renewable energy, all of which has had to be done, given the fact that we had very little clean energy to begin with. But we all know that coal is going to go away. It may not go away today, it may not go away tomorrow, it may even take 10 years or 10 or 20 years for it to go away. But coal and lignite is going to go away. Now, if we see examples from other countries or other coal-bearing regions, where coal has actually been phased out. And some of this is not even related to climate, by the way. This is just pure economics. Most of these places have taken close to about 50, 70 years for an economic regeneration. Until today, some of this economic regeneration is still happening. The most famous examples are actually the Ruhr region in Germany. UK is one other example. These two, to some extent, show elements of success. But then you have many regions in Central Europe which actually are still facing the backlash of an unplanned and an unmanaged transition. So when you ask what are the elements, I'm not even talking about what are the elements of a just transition. I'm just saying, between you and me, for India, what should we think about? We should first start thinking about how do we define a coal transition worker in India? Because check the number of Coal India, of Neyveli Lignite, of any of the companies, or whatever you get in their annual reports is actually on-roll employees. But everyone who works in the sector will tell you that there are as many or more off-roll employees or contract laborers. These are sometimes employed for 3 months in a year, for 6 months in a year, for 8 months in a year. So when you define a coal transition worker or a lignite transition worker or a fossil fuel transition worker, how do you incorporate this entire informal economy into your definition? Another very brief example, think about the brick sector. We have about 140 brick kilns in India. Back of the envelope calculation tells you that there are close to about 15 million brick employees, but they work only 6 months in a year. They work from December to January to June, and from June to December, because brick making doesn't happen, they go back to their other activities. Now, when you have a formal definition of a fossil fuel transition worker, people who are on books will benefit out of this, but people who are off books are going to be in trouble. So how about we start talking about, even in states like Rajasthan, again, as one of the speakers mentioned, you don't have coal mining, or rather you have lignite mining, but not as much. But there is an entire economy that subsists around lignite mining, that subsists around coal coming into Rajasthan to fuel its thermal power plants. So first, let's start thinking about that. What this helps us doing, this helps us identify what are the costs and at what areas we will be requiring an intervention going forward. What are the gaps? For example, if you look at how Green Skill Council trains workers in the renewable energy program, your basic entry requirement is that you need to be a fresher who can enter the formal white collar market. How about so many workers who possibly are not even 10th pass? We know the education background of many people who are engaged in physical labor is not very high. So how do you then incorporate these social indicators? Can we have an assessment? Once you identify who needs to be incorporated, then you can actually carry out an assessment exercise. What is this? This allows you to plan the timeline that is going to end up taking place for the transition, because it is not a 10-year game, it is not a 20-year game, it's not even a 30-year game. It is a lot longer than what any of us are thinking. It tells you what is the amount of money that you're going to put and where you're going to need this money. This then gets you a framework to start looking at how to finance this. Do we look at blended finance? Do we look at development finance? Coupled with guarantees from multilaterals? How do we incentivize institutional investors to come and invest not just in the technical upgradation of our systems, but also in the socio-economic aspect when it comes to economic regeneration activities? So when we're looking at it from a just transitions perspective, and you brought in elements of environment, you brought in elements of employment, we have to think about it from a regional industrial policy or a state industrial policy. What are your existing programs that from where money can be reallocated going forward? Can we have a continuity despite change in governments going forward? How to enable this kind of continuity going forward? That's one. These are, I'll stop here because we can continue going into different branches around this. Oh, and last point, one advantage that we have that many of the developed countries didn't have is many of our energy companies are state-backed enterprises. So if the state government and the central government actually have a clear planning agenda, the companies will follow it. Environmental remediation can happen. So that's one advantage that we have. It can also be construed as a disadvantage if there is no planning, but let's be positive and hope for the best. Thanks.
Thanks, Swati. I think towards the end, all of what you said on, looking at how to finance this, in the end, it feels like everything in any country, and especially in ours, eventually will come down to that. And again, unrelated, but those of us who've been working on the air quality campaign and how there is a big decision yet to be made on whether or not to install the FGDs, and so many of the think tanks and the reports that they have done. In my limited understanding as a layperson, it turned out that the per unit cost, that the way it will increase is to the tune of 30 paisa to 40 paisa. And even then, the government has asked for evidence on how does a 30 paisa compare to how many people will die. So if that's the way, decisions are made for us in terms of what's the trade-off between human health and cleaning up the power sector, I think we really, really are a long way away from when we can decide logically about just the kind of things that you said. But maybe, the silver lining in all this cloud is that, like you said, if you think about state or regional level industrial regeneration activities, policies, which really are not just taking one industry out and putting another in, but just looking at economic regeneration, because clearly, at least the next 5 years and COVID stricken, nothing earth shattering will happen, because hard to take out money from the pocket, so to speak. But Amit ji, sir, if I can ask you in the same vein that Swati ended her initial comments, I think I'm sure there will be more to be said on how the social costs of such a transition, not just in Rajasthan, but actually in India, can be addressed through some worthwhile policies and practices, especially given that there is a wide range of complexity and challenge in even identifying what the costs are in the first place. All the speakers have also said lignite mining, you know it better than others, I'm sure. The way I understand is not too much coal mining in Rajasthan. Other states are mining, Rajasthan is buying power. So to that extent, if coal jobs will be lost, those will not be in Rajasthan, but somewhere jobs will be lost and somewhere the impact will happen. How, the interlinkages also happen when you're looking at energy transition of one state? That's my question to you. How do those interlinkages happen and how do those decisions get taken? And second part is, how do you think, there are those specific policies or some kind of understanding at the center or at the state level, which can make these social costs of transition some actual topics which can be discussed within the government? Where again is the discussion on the social cost of transition? Sorry if the question was too bundled up with everything, but I know you can catch it.
Thank you, Aarti, and thank you, Sarthak, for your very Sarthak presentation. And all my fellow panelists have already shed so much light on the topic. And I think I am left with the most complex of it. And that is still much more complex because I, being an engineer, donning this hat of social transformation, I think first of all, I would like to share a couple of views that I have on energy transition. One is that when we talk of energy transition, predominantly it is more about electricity transition rather than energy transition. So we very conveniently forget about other energy usage that also require transformation, whether those are in transportation, whether those are for cooking, or whether those are for MSMEs, particularly for micro and small industries. So that was point number one. Point number two, that the social cost of transition again is looked at more from the point of view of impacts of transition, and particularly impact in terms of what would happen to regions which are dependent on coal for their economic development or for livelihood. Yes, that is an important factor. But I think that when we talk of energy transition, and this is something Sarthak alluded to when he talked about inclusivity, or when he gave an example of that NL official who talked of only few people getting benefited out of energy transition. And what I'm trying to say is that for me, energy transition has to squarely also address the issues of energy poverty and energy access. And why I'm saying that? Because, for example, if I take Rajasthan, per capita electricity consumption in Rajasthan is around 1300 kilowatt hour per annum, which is almost 50% of that of Gujarat. So that means there is a lot of scope and requirement for better electricity penetration in Rajasthan, that is access part. And secondly, let us also take Ujjwala as one of the transition mechanism. But what happened? So many Ujjwala connections were provided, but as I read, last year in Rajasthan, at about 35% of Ujjwala connectees actually gave up whatever refill they used to have. And I think that average has been 3.21 LPG refills a year. So that means the affordability of whatever transition we are talking about is an important aspect, and something that also gets missed out in the overall debate of social impacts of of energy transition when we talk about. So keeping these in view, I think, Aarti, you asked about the financial resources and other kind of thing. I think this is going to be a national goal, where states like Rajasthan and other states will have to align their own strategies so that collectively we are able to reach a stage where whatever defined goals are there, in whatever time frame we reach there. And why I'm saying that, I'm taking the example of pan-EU just transition mechanism, where they are looking at an umbrella mechanism which brings together the financial resources, which then is allocated to coal-rich countries like Poland and all for them to transit. So that means in India also, from the financial resources perspective, I think this is going to be a national endeavor where, of course, different states, depending on their own requirement, will feed into. So that is point number one. Point number two, that for Rajasthan to contribute into that, it can do that meaningfully in two ways. One, to maximize exploitation of the renewable energy potential it has. Now, Simran very eloquently talked about the handicap that distribution utilities have, and I fully agree with that. But somehow I also feel that our mindset have been rather rigid, because we work in a certain framework where renewables are taken as an addendum or an afterthought. Probably time has come to think in terms of renewable as the centerpiece and then putting together other pieces around that. So probably that also needs to be done. But second meaningful way where Rajasthan can contribute into this whole energy transition journey is on the demand side management, whether from the point of view of buildings or whether point of view of other things. So that is as far as resources are concerned. I also feel that it's not going to be only lack of financial resources, it's also going to be lack of capacities at local level, particularly at local level. And lot of hand-holding, lot of capacity building on that front would be required, which again leads back to more and more financial resources. What I also see, and we did a case study of Batul, where, as Swati said, purely because of economic reasons, number of coal mines have been shut down. And that had nothing to do with environment, that had nothing to do with climate change. But again, the impact has been similar. But again, whatever decisions are taken, how the DMF fund is going to be utilized, whether it is going to be utilized for refurbishing an airport or building highways in urban centers, nowhere community is involved in all of that. Until unless we are able to meaningfully and really involve communities in these decisions, I think we again would be scratching the surface only. So, Aarti, I don't know whether I have been able to respond to your complex question, but I will stop at the moment here only, and then let's see what happens later on. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, sir. And sorry to fold a lot in every time for all the panelists, but just trying to maximize, you know, any of the insights that the participants can receive. I mean, few things that you said, I think are worth maybe talking about in the next 10 or 15 minutes that we have. But I picked what you said on the big energy transition also being a national endeavor in the end, and states will align. And, you know, that also brings me to one of the important discourses in the climate debate as of beginning of this year or sometime in the last year. The whole concept of net zero and the way it is written in the Paris Agreement basically is about bringing emissions down to zero by mid-century. But what now is happening across the world is just one after the other, countries, corporations, cities, states coming out with their own plans on when emissions will come to zero. So, you know, all the big fish in the pond, so to speak, have given their net zero targets. And there is a big expectation that India will also announce net zero. And in the end, you know, of course, there will be transport sector and industry sector, which will have a role to play. But given that the power sector in India is far ahead, at least as compared to the other sectors, I think there is a lot of expectation also from the power sector to come and say promising, to give promising statements on how, you know, it eventually can contribute to India's net zero. I want to ask this question actually to all the panelists. Certainly, I want to start with you, Swati, and Karthik, if you can come in as well, on how, you know, what net zero means for states in India in terms of an energy transition. Swati?
So I actually honestly don't think India will announce a net zero target anytime soon. I'll be very honest about it. I mean, I know COVID has delayed it, but I think we were going to auction 67 new coal blocks in May. You can't auction coal blocks on one end and then talk about net zero on the other end. So from that perspective, I mean, there are some in the ministry who still think we are going to hit 1.5 billion tons of coal in 2030. So, you know, I'm just dialing back on on India and the net zero conversation right there. But in the eventuality that whenever we do end up having a net zero announcement, what would it entail? What would that mean? What is the global context talking? I mean, your question was more on what is the global discourse happening, meaning for the states. Well, for one, it means that we're not going to get any money to put into any new thermal power plant. I mean, there's been no investment in new thermal power plant for the last 5, 6, 7 years at least. Most of our investment has actually come in from State Bank of India, Japan, Korea, and China. China is the only participant now that still is still agreeing to fund thermal power plants across the world. So, and State Bank is saddled with a lot of NPA. So I don't know where new investments are going to come from. So that's going to be one impact that we are going to see for states. Similarly, on the coal mining side of it also, it's going to impact who's going to finance your coal mining activities at the end of the day. So in many ways, it is, yes, sending a signal that that the world is moving away from coal and therefore India should move away from coal. But given the fact that we're also state-owned enterprises and which has a lot of sovereign backing and sovereign guarantee, NTPC, and financing of NTPC is one of the such examples. We cannot completely say that there will be no new coal funding despite all the global conversation on net zero. On the state side, I think there are 2 or 3 states who've already made press announcements that they don't want to fund any more thermal coal plants. But I don't think the discoms and the transmission authorities are going in tandem with the state and the generation authorities. I think that coordination is missing. So while the states may announce that, oh, we're not going to do any new coal plants, as Simran had mentioned in his earlier remarks, it's still cheaper in many places to go with coal than to go with renewables. So that lack of coordination doesn't mean, so these announcements don't mean much without any coordination across the supply chain. So what the global discourse for states in particular means, well, not much. Very honestly, it tells you the globe is going in one direction, you're probably going in the other direction. But we've always put our domestic priorities over and above what the globe tells us. So that's my perspective. Thanks.
How do you want to analyze this schizophrenia, Karthik?
I think, no, and well said by Swati. You can dial it back, given the sort of the dissonance between what's happening, globally and the own sort of domestic production targets. I think this ties a little bit to what Amitji was saying about capacity, and also what Swati is alluding to, the sort of, the generation and distribution, and then sort of political declarations, because it is notable that I think 4 or 5 Indian states have made political declarations to either develop no new thermal, or develop no new thermal and phase down, as was the case with Karnataka, which was probably the most bold statement, and or are part of other international coalitions to sort of limit greenhouse gas emissions, as is the case with, I think, Bengal and Telangana and Chhattisgarh, which are part of the Under 2 coalition. But until and unless there's sort of institutional streamlining, and I think this needs to happen fast, and I know institutional innovation is one of the slowest moving pieces of the puzzle. We can't get to a pathway of net zero. And this is where there are so many different cooks in the kitchen, both at the central level and at the state level, that manage India's electricity and energy thinking, that we're not able to actively manage this energy transition. When you have 3 different ministries responsible for India's power sector, and this is what I think Amitji was saying, is that maybe, the Department of Non-Conventional Energy Sources, when it was set up in 1982, was just a department, and then was upgraded to a ministry. And that was at a time when renewables needed a big boost, and state nodal agencies needed to sort of socialize the importance of renewable energy for the population. And now I don't think we're in that universe anymore. Now it's discoms are running these large auctions for PPAs for large scale, gigawatt scale renewable energy. Now power is power. And I think we need one ministry of power, maybe at the central level, and that requires some rejigging. And this is the hard stuff, right? This is the difficult reforms that we need. We have a ministry of coal whose main mandate is to increase targets. How do you get to net zero if your mandate is just to increase? Imagine a ministry of coal whose mandate it was to ensure that we get electricity not from coal. And what does that mean to the discussion? Does that mean that Coal India Limited then gets in the game of renewables only, as they're starting to do, I believe, with Ignat wafer manufacturing and photovoltaic module manufacturing plant development? And I think this needs to happen at the state level, because, as I was alluding to before, the private sector is going to go and be aggressive in the field of transition, but it's the state-owned utilities, the central ones, as well as the state GenCos. They need to now be shareholders in these large renewable energy projects. It can't be that the state GenCos are left holding the bag of coal while all the private developers get to do the shiny new thing of renewables, which is, has lower costs in terms of fuel stock going forward. And this is where, if we're going to get to net zero, we need to address the cash flow risks and the business diversification needs of everything from Coal India Limited and NTPC and Indian Railways to all the state GenCos, so that it's them that are active shareholders in this. And this is going to require, again, some major institutional reorg, and it's going to require political courage as well as putting it at the top of the list, because we're at a point where we can't get messaging that we will develop a gas-based economy on one hand, which, as Amitji rightly pointed out, now people are not going for refills, and Ujjwala was hugely successful and should be commended in what it did. But then you've now got a power ministry and a minister saying we're going to have an electricity-based economy, and by the by, induction cooking and electrification of transportation is going to eat into our oil and gas shares and the need to reduce the import bill. So this dissonance has to stop if we get to net zero. I would also argue that the states that are making these political declarations are probably inviting that kind of expertise to rethink how to redesign institutions and get some assistance on making this transition happen. And there are some states which aren't as bought into the coal value chain that are because of geography, the hydro states, the Keralas, the Goas that don't have the GenCos that could say they're net zero tomorrow and choose to procure only renewable energy. And so maybe it's not the central government announcing net zero, and they may, but there are some Indian states that could very well get to net zero, should they wish. And Rajasthan's probably in that camp if it wanted to get there.
Thanks, Karthik. I think the bottom line is interesting. I mean, despite all the troubles with trying to bring together a net zero conversation in India, the way you said that Rajasthan is one of the states which can look at net zero. I mean, of course, there are a lot of institutional streamlining, many things that need to happen, but pretty much like the climate debate, it all just comes down to political will and the ability to take that massive leap of faith and then try to see how, it all comes together. But certainly, it just feels in a very limited way that a lot of whatever the contribution of the energy sector will be towards net zero, setting up of renewables and doing things like battery storage and combining hybrids of renewables with battery storage will not be a problem. The problem will be to bring the existing infrastructure to back down and, where the elements of that will go. There was a news report, and you all must be knowing the details of it, where the last couple of years, Coal India has been shedding some 5% of jobs every year, and already, some 60 or 75,000 jobs have been shed in the last couple of years. I mean, in a way that has happened without any trade union protests or without any lot of movement building around why jobs have been lost, etc. And maybe one question to ask is, was it unplanned and chaotic, or was it just happening because it had to happen that way? I mean, if Coal India can get rid of those jobs, or those people can be employed somewhere, then maybe yes, Swati, it will be nice to hear from you on this. I mean, is that just the way it should happen? Is it because it happened in a wrong way? We're slightly digressing. I will come back once to Amitji and to Simran on some pending questions, but first on this from you.
Actually, yes, Coal India has divested on-roll jobs, but these same jobs have gone to basically labor contract workers and MDOs. So, and this has also aided their profitability. Basically, it's helped their bottom line and operation and the cash flow situation within Coal India, despite the fact that coal demand has not gone up. So it's actually not true that Coal India has shed jobs. There has been some amount of marginal retrenching that has happened, yes. But that's more of, the voluntary retirement and people who've reached that age group. But there has been a good number of uptake in your labor contract workers and your MDO mine development operators, which have sort of balanced the job losses on this side. So, which is why, I think Coal India as a company is planning for the eventual demise of coal, but the way they see it is about 10, 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line. So, but they are not looking at it not yet looking at it from a labor perspective. Because if you start thinking about it from a labor perspective, then you have to actually quantify how many people are on your books. That's point number one. You have to think about what you're going to do with the pensioners, because you have a large bulk of pensioners dependent on Coal India and the current employees of Coal India. So, and given the way the pensions are structured within Coal India, the bulk of the contribution still comes from the people who are still working there. So that those aspects are not yet there. So, you know, when you're talking about elements of, I mean, all of these broadly, very broadly come under elements of just transitions, and we're not there yet. Despite all the conversation that's happening in the civil society and among think tanks, I don't think from an institutional perspective, and I think that's what Karthikeya had also mentioned, from an institutional perspective, we're not there yet. And it's going to take a, I mean, steps are being taken in that direction. And it's going to take a while. That's my comment. Sorry for.
No, and thanks for bringing this in. I mean, okay, what you said about Coal India is also quite a different but a relevant topic for discussion. So it's just shifting of contracts one way into another, and it's more like a disguised employment of some sort. But yeah, I think it's not good to be lost at this moment on the somber note that we are not there yet. Of course, all these are humongous matters, but the thing is that even if right steps get taken at the right time and a couple of right things are done, it can propel the state on something positive. And that was the question, that was the spirit with which I opened this whole question of social transition. And with my limited experience on moderating such things, is whenever you open these big questions of transition, they become so fundamental and theoretical at the same time that it's hard to just even assimilate or crystallize what it means in terms of real economy. And I think that's the real challenge of this. I have some questions from a couple of journalists. Maybe it is just better to read out those questions, and each one of you in the panel can see how you want to address. But before that, there is also a question on the Kusum scheme. Simran, would you like to take up that question on how Rajasthan will have to increase daytime power through providing solar as part of Kusum? And is this going to affect the thermal operations and costs, and what will this mean?
Sure. So at least for now, the target for Kusum scheme in Rajasthan for grid connected solar is about 325 megawatt. And even if we take into account off-grid and on-grid solar pumps, it's about 500 megawatts, right? That's about 1.5% of the 30 gigawatt solar and wind target of 2024. And about, I'll see the 0.3 to 0.4% of Rajasthan's demand, which varies between 11,500 to 12,000 megawatt, right? So it's very, very, very marginal, right? To begin with. But let's assume that there's going to be, a larger penetration by 2030, and after that, there are definitely benefits and challenges there, right? The impact on integration of solar, whether on the distribution substation side or anywhere in the grid, is going to be the same on the operations of thermal power plants. If we are ramping them down, their utilization factors or plant load factors are going down. Their efficiencies is going to decrease. The marginal cost of power dispatch is going to increase, right? But significant gains of integrating solar at the distribution grid level. To begin with, there's avoidance of transmission infrastructure. There's avoidance of acquisition of lands in resource-starved areas, especially for Rajasthan. And of course, we can also avoid a lot of technical losses on the transmission and even some on the distribution side. The challenge, of course, comes in terms of grid balancing. And I think agriculture is a significant resource when it comes to balancing the grid, right? The way I see is, let's say as a socialist and environment conscious citizen, is that the thermal assets or the generation assets are largely set up to feed the industries. Agriculture is being electrified over the last 2 decades, right? And still there is a long way to go. Ideally, we often say that, agriculture is subsidized and that's a problem. But in my opinion, for farming should only pay marginal cost of electricity because the infrastructure is set to serve somebody else, right? Even if you look at, in terms of quality of services, whether it's supply of power or whether it's, in what dignified manner farmers are treated as consumers. There's a whole lot of difference there, right? So that being said, the farmers are waking up late in the evening, at night to water their fields and actually contributing to ensure that there's sufficient base load for thermal power to continue operating, right? With the shift of Kusum scheme, right now, let's say it's very, very small. The agriculture contributes about a third of Rajasthan's electricity demand, or about 40%, if I'm not wrong, right? So if the penetration is significant, we will see a shift. There will be a need on the distribution side to plan for that transition in terms of how they're going to, balance the demand on the 24-hour cycle. Obviously, they will have to address the issue of theft and power leakages on the downstream side to ensure that they are able to sustain as a business, because right now that's also a concern. One of the reasons the supply is not 24/7 is also because it's just not viable given the amount of theft that is there. But there's one more advantage that could be that distribution utilities can derive if they look at it a little bit innovatively. So we looked at substation data for 132 kVA in Rajasthan in 2017. Unfortunately, we couldn't get our hands on 33 kV substation data. At that time, 2017, 54% of substations were overstressed, which means their utilization was in the range of 95% to 100%, often exceeding that, which will be managed through curtailments. One example will be, I have been going to Bajju, which is about 70 kilometers from Bikaner, a 3.15 megawatt, 33 kV substation with a total demand of about 4.25 megawatt. Since 10 years, I'm going to that station. It's not augmented. For the 6 hours in the day that agriculture supply is given on rotational basis, residential and the market supply is discontinued, right? So from augmenting capacity using RE and storage, there's a huge opportunity in Rajasthan given the significant amount of stressed distribution infrastructure that is there, or overstressed distribution infrastructure that is there, right? So yeah, I'll stop at that. So there are challenges, but there are also many, many opportunities when it comes to Kusum scheme.
Thanks, and thanks for the detailed answer. I mean, roughly it does mean that the more you can push adoption of solar pumps by the agriculture sector, ultimately you can take away the troubles of cross subsidies, and maybe, the discoms can benefit in the long run, but no easy answers. We are kind of moving towards wrapping up. There are 2 more questions. Actually, the Great Indian Bustard question has come up again. It's from Vijay Pinjarkar at Times of India, Bombay, where the question is about taking power lines underground is the solution to save the GIB, and what plans Rajasthan government has. The problem, I know we don't have the government representatives here, and Rohitji spoke of this before, but given you all are also practitioners, and would you like to at least share your view on the matter? And I can open the floor for all the panelists. Feel free to come in very briefly to just address the question of the Supreme Court judgment on undergrounding of power lines to save the endangered bird. Simran, Kartikeya, anyone likes to go first?
Happy to jump in just briefly.
Sure.
I'm an ecologist by training, so I'll just caveat with that. And wildlife management was one of the things that I studied. So, this is we're talking about a species that's endangered here. And I think And I think that needs to sort of be the priority. That's just my take on it. And for a state like Rajasthan, and I'm originally from Jodhpur and know the importance of tourism for the state's economy. When we couple these two things together, having one of the last habitats of this critically endangered bird is a no-brainer. I think it's unfortunate that this was not thought about before, and I understand the pains this means for the project developers. But we're at a point where, in the post-COVID reality, we're talking about ecological restoration projects in many parts of the world as a way to come back from COVID, as a way to build better. And large-scale infrastructure projects that have wildlife overpasses or underpasses to make sure that we're protecting the genetic viability of populations of wildlife that are incredibly stressed. And we're talking about coming out of a pandemic, a zoonotic disease that came about as a result of close proximity of people encroaching into wilderness spaces and the way we treat wildlife. I think this is the time to have a real rethink about how we do infrastructure planning. If every infrastructure project isn't accounting for genetic viability of wildlife and particularly critically endangered species, it's a missed opportunity to actually build back better and smarter from this pandemic. Now, the fact of the matter is we need to figure out how we can come up with $4 billion to make these transmission lines go underground, because I think, this infrastructure project probably needs to go forward too. But then we need to free up the cash to make sure that the transmission lines go underground and the bird has a future and the green energy has a future. And this is where I leave it up to the fiscal managers of the state and the central government to figure that out, because that's called sort of building back better. And there's probably a way to come up with that money. So that's my take on it.
Fair enough. Simran, would you like to come in as well?
Sure. I mean, the case was in the Supreme Court for a long time, and it was, activists who taken it there and really fought for the cause. It just reflects poorly on the, environmental and social consciousness of our institutions. And recently, from the Ministry of Environment, very counter sort of their core objective communication has been coming out. Especially on the dilution of environmental impact assessment. And this also raises a key, raises the question of why solar should be, excluded from EIA. But that being said, I think this is a really unfortunate, and I'm less hopeful within the current scenario in terms of, power sector finances and even the state government's finances in the pandemic era. So needs to be done. I think any conscious citizen, like Karthik said, it's a no-brainer. How it's going to be done? Is it going to be done soon enough? Is a big question mark. I think what I'll just say that even in respect of this problem and climate action, by the time it becomes economically and politically viable, it will probably be too late.
Would any of the other panelists like to come for any last words? I mean, the big question is that we also cannot just wipe out a species to install solar or any technology. And in the end, we don't want to undertake a transition away from fossils in a way that we set a wrong precedent for how we are doing it. And that indeed is the larger question, whether it's 4 billion, whether the RE developers have overstated that amount. Maybe it will cost less. I think that kind of devil is really in the details. But Mr. Amit Kumar, sir, anything that you'd like to say on this?
Yeah, Aarti, the fact that if we, and we means renewable energy people, call ourselves as green energy people, then we of course cannot omit the ecological part of it. Those times have gone where only the environmental part used to be looked into. So obviously we will have to be much more responsible as the days goes on. But the question for me is that what were the bid conditions at that time? And I'm coming to who is responsible to take care of the costs that are involved right now. And these are the kind of things, particularly for GIB kind of situation, whosoever has bidded for that must have taken into account in very clearly mentioning it in the bid document, so that people, the industry who are bidding for it, knew that what kind of cost they are going to incur in that. So in a way, without belittling the cost of ecology that has gone into it, it is also a bit unfair in case it was not a part of bid condition to load everything onto the developers. And here actually I come to the larger question. We in India seem to be fixated on the lowest tariff than anything else. And probably that's what needs to be looked into from the point of view of ecology, and as well as from the point of view of whether our projects, the renewable energy projects, are climate resilient or not.
Right. I mean, I think this opens another full discussion, because really the attractiveness of renewables so far had been that it's cheaper, that it's cost effective, and I think the markets have turned the tide towards solar and wind projects just for the cost competitiveness of renewables. And if that mindset has also to include other costs, and the fact that it's not just about cost competitiveness, you also have to take resilience of infrastructure, other criteria in mind, then really it's that fundamental point that you addressed somewhere in the beginning as well, where I'm forgetting what you said, but really the whole thing was that we have to look at this not just as a reduction in cost, but a lot more in terms of social transition per se. We are nearly closing the end of the panel. Swati, I wanted to ask you if you had any last words, just in terms of winding up the discussion on what the implications are, big picture.
So I think since this topic pertains about Rajasthan in particular, I would think that given Rajasthan's advancement in renewable energy, from a distribution perspective, yes, there are going to be challenges on integration that will happen, but eventually we will have to cross this, and Rajasthan seems to be in a good place, particularly in terms of the overall generation portfolio, similar to Himachal Pradesh, where most of your generation is actually from green. In Himachal, it's hydro. In Rajasthan, it has the potential to be from solar and wind. But alongside this, I think it's important to not just look at the macro picture, but also the smaller picture. And I will keep coming back to this, or rather I keep coming back to this in all my discussions, that transitions are not just about technology, transitions are about people at the end of the day. It's about changing mindsets, it's about changing attitudes, it's about changing behaviors. We've become very entrenched in a fossil fuel society. So to change that mindset and behavior, education is not just enough. Like, it's not enough for you to be educated, but also for you to understand the importance, and you don't sometimes even need to be educated to know the importance of just shifting to a greener technology. But this knowledge building, as Amit sir had actually said, this capacity building process needs to happen, because it is not a 5-year period, it is not a 10-year period. This is going to take a very long time for us to transition. And if states like Rajasthan can actually show us that way, if actually cuts can work with the state government of Rajasthan and show the rest of us how we can do this. Of course, it can be tailor-made to every individual state, but we need a framework in place, and I hope that this happens soon. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the point that transition will not be about technology. So transition ultimately will not come by putting up solar panels and driving electric cars. It will come with a lot of change in the social fabric, and that will be multi-decadal. This is a very small part of a very big conversation, but I think we will put some of the building blocks together in our lifetime. I will pause and thank you very much, each one of you, for your time this morning. I will pass it back to Sarthak and the cut team to close it. But thanks very much, everyone, once again.
Thanks, Arti.
Thank you,
Thank you so much,
Aarti.
Aarti.
Yeah, I'll just, before wrapping up this discussion, I think Swati touched on the right nerves, which I was also about to come on to in terms of closing remarks. But I'll just digress a little bit for 2 minutes and draw your attention to the Club of Rome's 1972's report Limits to Growth, where one of the lead authors said that all the current systems are perfectly designed to produce the results that they are currently producing. And therefore, in order for any structural shifts to happen, people must learn to learn first, listen first, and then act on it again in the organized manner. And in that, I think the context of just transition and energy transition in the power sector comes into play, because I think the approach is becoming more like preaching the community of what the impacts will be on you, rather than learning from them. And at times, or on most times, their lack of capacity is used as a constraint, but that is only in our heads, and instead it is this unfiltered and unbiased approach and the learning that they can give, which should be the driving force of it. We had a very engaging discussion here, and for especially for the researchers in the audience like me, we have a lot of flesh to pound upon going forward. We heard Karthikeya touch upon issues of financing, and in doing that, unearthing the latent opportunities that come along with it. And also, he discussed some of the political economy aspects, particularly the private versus public ownership models of the companies and utilities which are at the center of this transition. We heard Simran very eloquently describe what the ground level situations are in terms of governance, operational, and financial sides of it, particularly from the point of view of discoms, who are primed to be the torch bearers of the discussion, but are too stressed to even operate, let alone think, plant, and act for the energy transition. And he also touched upon very insightful arguments with respect to how we perceive the agricultural sector as a consumer of this power sector. We had Swati talk about the coal economy and particularly the fault lines in the employment aspects of it, and how exploring different social indicators and then talking about the timeline framework and then the next steps would be a better idea. Other than that, in addition to that, she said very lucidly a forthcoming remark on net zero, which might rightly hurt a few places and few stakeholders. We had Mr. Amit Kumar talk about why and reminded us rightly that it is not just an electricity but an energy transition, and the perspectives of energy poverty and energy access should be aligned so that it becomes a national goal driven by a national philosophy and collective responsibility. And with that, I think I'd like to thank again all of you for your time, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thank you so much.